If you've ever walked into a Christian bookstore, or any bookstore probably for that matter, you'll notice that there's a poster that you always see. Always. In fact, it's so famous that it's on postcards and paintings and bookmarks and you name it. It's referred to simply as footsteps. Right? How many of you have ever had that poster that's called Footsteps? It's a poster simply of two sets of footprints walking in the sand. And if you remember the story of the poster, it represents God walking through life with us. And then at one moment, you'll see there's only one set of footprints. And it's at the most dark and difficult times of our lives. And the author turns to God and says, God, how could you have left me in my most difficult moment? And of course, we know God is reported to have said, my precious child, I never left you. In your darkest hour, it was then I carried you. I love that poster. Because I think, like many of you, I can speak to the truth of that event. Going through difficulties in life, often it is God who lifted us up and carried us through. In November 1979, within moments of my wife giving birth to our very first child, she experienced an unusual medical condition that should have taken her life. Here, this moment of tremendous joy is interrupted when suddenly she loses all of her blood pressure and there's panic in the delivery room. Nurses come flooding in. Doctors come flooding in. The delivery doctor is very intense. And as I was whisked out of the room to sign an emergency consent form for surgery, the nurse, I'll never forget her words, told me this. She said, even if she lives, she'll never have children again. That nurse needs a little work on her bedside manner, wouldn't you say, doctor? In both cases, she was wrong. In both cases, she was wrong. But that was one of those footprints moments. Those moments when God lifted Lori and I both up and carried us through that difficulty with healing, with strength, with compassion. And we all have those kind of footprints moments in our lives, don't we? Where we feel God carrying us. Now, I tell you that this morning by way of introduction to our story, because I want you to all understand very clearly that as we approach Jesus' fourth words from the cross, that is exactly what is not happening here. No matter how much we in the back of our mind realize that God works with us through our difficulties, as Jesus hung on the cross there that day, it was not happening. In fact, just the opposite. God doesn't carry Jesus through the difficulty. He doesn't accompany him through the difficulty. He leaves during the difficulty. And as we look at that this morning, there's three things I want you to see about this passage. First, it's the significance of the peculiarities of the passage. Matthew writes this in a way that's a little bit odd. Second, I want you to see the significance of the darkness. And third, the significance of the statement of Jesus. Those three things. The significance of the peculiarities of the passage, the significance of the darkness, and the significance of the statement. Now let's look at the significance of the peculiarities first. As our passage begins this morning, Jesus has been on the cross for about 3 hours. It's about noontime now when the passage begins, and he was put on the cross at 9 a.m. Now the passage covers those few verses from noon until 3 in the afternoon. And these time frames, by the way, will be very significant, as you'll see on Good Friday service. But what Matthew records here are two things that I find somewhat odd. The first we didn't read, But if you'll turn to verse 55, I'll show you. Look at verse 55. Many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus and John, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. So we have Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and John, and Salome, the mother of the sons of Zebedee. We just studied them last week, right? Now, as Matthew is recording this event, what I find odd is he never mentions Mary, the mother of Jesus. Nowhere is she found here standing by the cross. Now, why did he leave her out? Well, perhaps because she is not mentioned here, because by this time of the day, the women who were standing, if you remember last week, with Mary at the side of the cross, have now retreated from the cross. They've left Jesus. Why, we don't know. Perhaps because as much as they wanted to support Mary in her suffering, the gruesomeness of the situation was too much, and they withdrew. We don't know. But the passage tells us by this time they are watching from a distance. They are watching from a distance. Now, some have speculated the reason that Matthew left Mary out here is because when he wrote his gospel, he used the book of Mark as his source book. And he wrote his gospel basically around the book of Mark. And most theologians believe that's true, that he took the book of Mark and then used it to write the book of Matthew, in which case Mark didn't mention Mary there, so Matthew wouldn't either. But I think that logic's really pretty thin, because after the cross, everyone knew that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there. So I believe Matthew, by not mentioning her, is really saying something to us. And I believe what he's saying is as he intentionally focuses on those people that are far away from Jesus, especially those people who have now retreated from the cross and are standing at a distance, I think he's emphasizing to us that at this time on the cross, Jesus is almost completely alone. Probably Mary, his mother, is still there, and probably the Apostle John. But I think Matthew here is emphasizing how alone Jesus is by this point in his suffering. Second thing I find peculiar about this is that of all the 7 words of the cross, Matthew and Mark only record this one. We have to go to Luke and John to find the other 6. Matthew and Mark only use this one word from the cross. And I think the significance of that is, especially in Mark, who tends to be very succinct in his storytelling, he's covering the highlights. And I believe both of them intentionally include this word alone, because probably more than any other word that Jesus spoke on the cross, this one tells us what was happening there. More than any other words. Not that the others weren't important, they certainly are. But this one summarizes what happened that day on the cross. So let's take a look at that event. Look at verse 45. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over the land. Let's look at the significance of that darkness. According to the text, there was darkness over the whole land, which interestingly enough was foretold by the prophet Amos. And the reality of that darkness really comes into focus when you realize it happened at high noon. The brightest part of the day, and it is completely dark. The Greek word here that's used for land refers to the land mass of the entire earth. So certainly this darkness was not a local event as it would have been in an eclipse. It extended over the known world and perhaps over the entire world at that time. In fact, history records that other people in different parts of the world saw this darkness. They experienced it. Dionysius was an Egyptian And listen to what he says about how unique this darkness was. Either the God of nature is suffering, or the machine of the world is tumbling into ruin. Isn't that something? Either the God of nature is suffering, or the machine of the world is tumbling into ruin. So great, so thick, so dark was this darkness that even a pagan recognized it as something besides a natural event. This was no eclipse. The Egyptians were very familiar with eclipses by this time, and nowhere did they record that this was an eclipse. Rather, they record that it was something supernatural. It was an event of immense horror, because for the first time since the creation of the world, the God of creation turns his back on his creation. Now, why do I say that? Listen to these passages. 1 John 1:5, and you'll see where I'm going. This is the message we have heard from him and declare to you. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. Revelation 21:23, the city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light. Exodus 34, when Moses came down from the Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant of law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. You see, in Scripture, the presence of God is always described by light. When Israel marched through the desert, it was a pillar of light that led them through the desert. When Moses came down from Sinai, his face was glowing because of his time he had spent with God. And when the angels spoke to the shepherds on that first Christmas morning, it is recorded that the glory of the Lord shone round about them. The moral purity of God is such that it radiates light. So pure and so far from the effects of sin is he that he beams purity in the form of light. God is light, the Scripture says. In him there is no darkness at all. Now contrast that with the cross. We see it here. Anti-light, almost. Complete darkness. And what is darkness but the absence of light? Imagine for a moment the most despicable person you can imagine. Serial killer, maybe? Child pornographer? Terrorist out to maim and kill? Whatever you can imagine 1,000 of them hanging on the cross. Imagine 1,000,000 of them hanging on the cross. And you begin to understand what is happening there. Jesus, who was the light of the world, now personifies its darkness. All the sins of the world heaped on one man. All of it. The worst of all of it. There on the cross. And the moral purity of God at that point could not bear even the presence of his sins. And that's why we read from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over the land. God had left. Now during those 3 hours, Jesus entered into the very depths of suffering. Here he wrestled with evil and the powers of darkness and the reality of sin that even he had never experienced before. Here for the first time he experienced the Father's displeasure. Not with him, but with the sin that he bore. He took it all on the cross. Alone. Alone. His disciples left him. His brothers didn't believe him. And now his Father even departs. Matthew Henry in his commentary says this. I thought these were very striking words. Never were there 3 such hours since the day that God created man on the earth. Never